Welcome to our third COVID-19 cabin fever video. I won't repeat what I've said in the preamble to the other two because it can be boring and you've already seen it. But I would like to say that this is a rare opportunity for you to see some fundamental history via Bob Whiteway about his fight to understand and then fight for the establishment of our sanctuary that we value so much. We owe Bob a great deal, and he very kindly consented to me re-showing this video that I did 10 years ago, and I hope you'll enjoy it and you'll learn something. I'm pleased today to be able to speak with Bob Whiteway. We all know Bob was instrumental in the creation of the Ricketts Point Marine Sanctuary and an ex-school teacher, and I thought it'd be interesting to find out what Bob's background was and what led him to be an activist in the creation of this sanctuary, because we're all affected by where we've come from in achieving these sort of things. So Bob, thanks for talking to Grey Path.
Pleasure.
And what's the story before the sanctuary? What did you do?
Do you ask that question about marine matters or generally?
Oh, I think generally. Where'd you go to school? What led you here to this wonderful beach and
right.
Commitment to it?
It's probably worth mentioning that as a young kid I lived in an inner suburban setting, and I had this beautiful farm that my grandmother and grandfather worked on, and it gave me a love of nature that I wouldn't otherwise have had. And I think I probably hooked into that when somebody, a friend from back in the teachers' college days, well, later on he took up snorkeling, and he suggested I give it a bash, and so I did. It was up at Ricketts Point, and I remember vividly going up there, and I was just gobsmacked, I think they'd say nowadays, by just being able to see the ripples in the sand. I'd never looked underwater and had a clear vision before in my life, but when I got to the reef, I was really blown apart. The reef actually ended quite quickly, as it does at Ricketts Point, and the sand took over the sea floor, and there was a stingray. I didn't know what it was, but in those days, but I now know it was an eagle ray. And yes, and so after that occasion, my friend died soon after from peritonitis following an appendix operation, and his wife gave me his flippers as a keepsake, and so I added the snorkel and mask to that and went myself, and I took to going on a regular basis just because it was so brilliant, and I mean brilliant. It was just dazzling in those days, and in terms of the variety of colour and shapes and organisms, and so I gradually started to map the reefs, and the way in which I learned was different from uni and school, because I would go to nature, I would find some animal, let's say the 11-armed sea star, examine it closely, and then I would hurry home. It was a post-haste, while it was still fresh in my mind, affair. and then I would ferret it out in one or other of my limited range of ID books and marine books, the likes of W.J. Dakin, Australian Sea Shores. That was my Bible, for instance. Australian Sea Life was another one. And from these books, I would not only ID the animal or plant, but usually animals, because there wasn't a book on plants, on seaweeds, of any sort in those days. I mean, who would want to publish a book on seaweeds? They'd sell 2.5 books, sort of thing. So I would then read about the animal, and in the case of the 11-armed sea star, I learned that the thing ate mussels, and I found out the incredibly interesting way in which they feed. And so when I went down next, I saw that the 11-armed sea star was quite often in the zone, subtidal zone, associated with mussels. So that, did I say that right?
Yeah.
The sea star was associated with the mussels. And so I started to see patterns of this sort, what you could call perhaps zonation. And instead of this maze, this kaleidoscope, being bewildering, it began to make sense and have patterns that were recognisable and understandable and comprehensible. So after, if you go, that was 1965, by 1970, 5 years, I was starting to get a fair handle on it all. And
so you also became an educator in the area fairly quickly because you're a school teacher, weren't you? Right?
That's a most interesting question or point that you bring up there. I'll tell you why. Because in those days, education meant chalk and talk by the teacher and kids deriving stuff from textbooks. It was kids going into a classroom where there were rows of desks, out of which kids never moved, except at morning tea and recess. Morning tea, and lunchtime. And the notion now, and this is what, let's say, proposes itself, though I didn't really consider this as a possibility because it was too outlandish, was imagine a classroom full of 40 children or 30, surrounded by scores of plants and animals, and bathed by beams of sunlight in 4 meters of water. Now, that was so different from what education was in those days. It was many things, but it certainly was not that, that picture that I just painted. And yet, that was what I would have to imagine if I was going to ever translate my hobby into a teaching reality in the classroom or with the undersea world as my classroom. That's what I would have to imagine. And the thing that really helped me on the way there was my wee daughter. She was only 3, but her attitude towards learning was so full of a sense of wonder and curiosity that I had an absolute ball walking along the beach. I only had to mention Rockpool, and she had her sun hat on, you know. She was like a dog when you rattle the keys. Wow, you know, let's go. And well, I became the kind of textbook that she would turn to when she wanted to. She would come and ask me a question. I didn't tell her stuff. We went beach combing, and we went rock pooling and so on. But it made me realise that I could probably go rock pooling with my students and get them out of the mould of the desks and the classroom and the chalkboard and so forth. And a different way of learning too, direct from nature, as I had done. Yes, well, she made me realise that we could perhaps do that. And the step that I made myself, not with her help, but myself, was that if I took them rock pooling, that'd be okay for a while, but really it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't because it was suitable for her age group, but it didn't offer the challenge, the sense of adventure and excitement that teenagers require and demand, and if they don't get it, they play up. And that's why there's a lot of problems with kids just at that age group, because there's a lack of excitement in their work. And I realised, you know, we've got it here, and all I have to do is overcome the reticence of the boss, of the deputy boss, to have anything happen that upset his timetable. If I could overcome that, maybe I was up there with a chance.